Hi, it's time for more coffee breaks. This is Joseph, or Muffin. Last video I started building this alien world base. Today I'll show you how I got it looking like this. Bear in mind that this was very experimental and not a perfect step-by-step. So if you want to make a similar base, you can easily skip some of my steps. This is how the base looked at the end of last video. Well, the first step is I'm just bringing out my Daler Crimson glaze here. It's actually an ink. And I'm starting to glaze in the areas that I want to be red. And that's mainly the water, where the water effects will be, as well as the plants and the tendrils. This will take several coats. During the first couple of coats it kind of looks more pink rather than the red. And that's because I'm glazing over ivory white by Vallejo here. Here's the red applied. Now when I make bases I use a lot of shades, and I tend to just slap them around wherever I feel like it. So this is not a pure science, more like an art, I guess. I started here with some Caribou Crimson by GW, and I'm directing this primarily around the water effects area as well as around the plants, so that we can kind of blend the two different elements together. You can see here they kind of start becoming more in line with the world around them, so they don't stick out like a sore thumb. Secondly, I brought this Drakenhof Nightshade, and I'm just adding this to the rock formations wherever I feel like it fits best, focusing primarily underneath, where shadows would naturally occur. That was my first shading step, and here's the base after that's completed. And I also brought my wet palette out, as you can see. On the wet palette I've got some ivory, some ice blue, some dark sea blue, hull red, black and royal purple, all by Vallejo, as well as a little bit of flow improver. I also put some of the crimson ink that I used before here on the palette. This is where I just slap paint around, so it's kind of experimental and maybe not the best step-by-step guide here, but I'm mixing some of the hull red with the dark sea blue. And the attempt here is that we bring the two different color elements together a little bit, and it also makes for a very desaturated color, so it won't be standing out very much. But hopefully if I add enough of these different paints and different colors everywhere, we can just add some confusion and variation that makes it look more natural. Now these are desaturated and quite dark, so I'm mainly doing these towards the shadowed areas. Here I'm also doing the same paint configuration, but with some added black. Next up I'm just slapping more paint on. Here we got the dark sea blue again. And you might be saying, oh, you already did this with the airbrush before, and that's true, so you could probably skip this step if you want. But I feel like if you go back and forth and just add the colors back and shade down, highlight up, etc., you could just let the process take over, and you never know where you will end up. And that's part of the fun as well. Here I'm just adding a little bit of ice blue, and these are for some highlights, as you can see here. It's very similar to what I did with the airbrush as well. Next I'm going back again with some dark sea blue, and I'm just making a transition between the highlights and the shades. Next up, I'm bringing out some of the pure ice blue for some dry brushing. This will pick out the detail of the rock as well as other textures, and will severely increase the contrast on the model. I also did just a little bit of dry brushing, or semi-dry brushing I guess, with some hull red mixed with ivory. And I'm doing these mostly on the areas where I previously had hull red laid down as the base coat. Next I'm moving on to the plants. I'm mixing some royal purple with the hull red and a little bit of black to make this sort of red-purple tone. And this will be used on the plants, because the plants all have these veins, because that's what makes them alien, I guess. They're kind of in between a plant and a living being. And I'm just lining these veins with this paint. I'm also adding a few veins where there aren't any sculpted, so you could easily just freehand these on if you didn't have these exact sculpts. This is what it looks like after that stage. Next, I thought that I would darken them up a little bit as well, so I brought out my Scale 75 Inkintensity Violet, and this is what I'm using for the middle of the veins to make them extra dark. Didn't have very good footage of this, but that's what I'm doing. I'm focusing towards the center of the veins. We'll keep going with the plants, and here I'm taking my pure ivory from Vallejo, and I'm just making some dots. This is very inexact, and I'm just going with the flow and placing them wherever I feel like I want to do it. I'm doing this experimentally, but also to create more interest, so that they're not just flat red pieces of vegetation here. Kind of resembles some amanita mushrooms, I guess. So if you have some models like that, you could probably use this same paint scheme for that. However, I want to also bring them a little bit back in line. So we're going back and forth again, and here we're adding some of the crimson ink back again as a filter across the plants to make the white dots stand out a little bit less. And here's how they look after that. Now before we move on to the fun stages, I'm just adding a little bit of extra highlighting in the water area, because I found it was a little bit too flat. So here we've got some ivory in the very center, and then I'm adding a little bit of the red glaze on top of it as well. I also found that the dry brushing that I did around the plants with the hull red ivory made it stand out a little bit too much. So I went in with some black mixed with hull red wash here around the plants, as well as spreading it around the ground, touching also upon the blue kind of rock texture so that they meld together. Then I went with some Druzy violet around those areas for some added variation again. And also adding a third color, because otherwise the entire base is just blue and red. And then I took some of my royal purple mixed with a little bit of ice blue to just do a quick dry brush at some designated spots. And now, at long last, it's time for the water effects. I'm using Realistic Water by Woodland Scenics, and in order to use that you have to mask off the area that you want to fill. So here you can see me using some electrical tape. I found that it works quite well. Your mileage may vary though. The point is that you have to make it tight so that at no place can the realistic water effects leak out. And now is the time. The realistic water actually dries clear, so I'm just adding a little bit of the crimson ink to tint it up a little bit. This is how I do it. You just use a pipette like this to carry the realistic water into the reservoir. You don't want to pour too much of it in at once because a lot of bubbles can be forming, and you want this to be kind of free of bubbles and lay evenly across the surface. This takes a long time to dry, so I usually wait about 24 hours. And that's what it says on the bottle as well. Here we are after the first layer is dried. One tip is that you can easily do realistic water effects in several coats or layers to deepen it. Though be aware that this will take a lot of drying time because each layer has to dry for about 24 hours or thereabouts. But for this layer I'm also adding these silica balls that you get in shoe boxes and electrical equipment and stuff like that. Usually says do not eat, and they have a lot of different applications when it comes to hobby here. I will be using them as bubbles in this water. You just take them and drop them in. They're not painted or anything, but they will show the paint underneath and also kind of look like a bubble. Whenever you use this realistic water effects, you'll notice that it is a liquid and it will not dry completely flat because of surface tension and stuff like that, so it will tend to collect around the corners a little bit more than in the center. Therefore, once you remove the tape, you might have to do some cleanup work, as you can see me doing here with an X-Acto-like knife. Can be a little bit bothersome because the realistic water effect doesn't dry super hard, and the slight softness makes it harder to cut. Now we have some water effects, but I found that I wanted to add a little bit more on the plants, and the dots that I already had were a little bit too soft, I felt, so I added a second coat of just white ivory dots on top of them. Now it stands out a lot, and as you can see I also added these white dots on top of the tendrils to try and connect them a little bit more to the rest of the plants. Before I went any further, as you can see I just blacked out the base rims. This is the next step in the experimentation here. I thought that the realistic water effects dries very glossy, so why not try and use that property in a different way. I poured in some in my cup as I did before and added just a little tiny bit of the same red ink that I did before. But this time I will actually be applying it with my brush. So I'm just using it as a paint and brushing it onto the plants. And the point of this is that I want them to be very icky and kind of like a mushroomy or living being kind of texture instead of being a plant. So I want them to be very glossy and sweaty. Having done that, I'm moving on to the last step of this base's journey. And I'm trying out this oohoo glue effect that I've seen many others use and I've myself used for blood effects before. This is a glue that while it dries, it gives you some opportunity to mess around with. It will become very stringy and you can use it to create drool effects or blood effects and similar stuff. Here I will be mixing some of that very same red ink as well as some black ink into the glue, and I'm just using these toothpicks to mix it around. And you might be able to see the kind of consistency that the glue has at the current stage. One thing to know if you want to work with the Uhu glue is that it dries quite fast, so you don't have the longest working time here. But here you can easily see it's starting to string up. You might have to wait just a little bit before you can get the very nice strings, but if you wait too long you will also have a hard time making it. You just take your toothpick, fill it up with some of the glue and slap it on somewhere, and then you just start working it around. Try to get the strings forming as you move the toothpick around. I find that this Uhu process actually makes me really feel like I'm there. I might work a little bit more on this later on as I add the figure, but for now I'll call it done. Here are some pictures. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope you were inspired by this video a little bit. This was quite an experimental and interesting base that I made, and I'm quite happy with how it looks. Let me know what you thought of it, and I hope to see you in the future. I'm still very new at making these videos, but I'm enjoying it, and as long as some people find these videos interesting, I will try to release more videos as often as I can. Well, until next time, go explore the world, but also do take a coffee break.